The bulldozer was still running when Carol Ashworth pointed her clipboard at me and said, "This is a gated community, Mr. Coleman. Squatters aren't welcome here." I stood in what used to be my great-grandfather's well house. Now it was a pile of hand-cut limestone and splintered cedar beams, crushed flat under 6 feet of fresh backfill. Steam still curled up through the dirt in thin white ribbons. Nobody else seemed to notice that. Nobody else knew what it meant. 210 homes. That's how many houses sat inside Comanche Ridge Estates, the gated community built around my family's land 40 years ago. 210 homes, every single one of them paying $600 a month for something called an eco-heating assessment. That's $126,000 a month, over $1.5 million a year. Over 4 years, more than $2.4 million had moved through Carol Ashworth's HOA accounts for a heating system she didn't build, didn't own, and, as I would come to find out, barely understood. By the time the first hard freeze came that December, houses that had never once dropped below 68 degrees in 40 winters were sitting at 41 degrees at 2 in the morning. Pipes split, water heaters cracked. An old man 3 doors down from the clubhouse had to be taken out on a stretcher because his oxygen concentrator's backup battery couldn't keep up in the cold. By the end of it, Carol Ashworth would owe more than $2 million in restitution. She'd lose her Range Rover, her house, and her freedom. But that's not really what this story is about. This story is about a valve, a 12-inch brass valve bolted into bedrock 90 years before Carol Ashworth was born, sitting on a piece of paper called a deed that nobody at Comanche Ridge Estates had ever bothered to read. What would you do if the people who bulldozed your family's gravesite smiled at you and called you a trespasser? Where are you watching this from tonight? Tell me in the comments below, because I want to know if you'd have waited as long as I did. My name is Walt Coleman. I'm 67 years old, and for 31 years I was a licensed geothermal well operator for the state of Colorado. That license is still active. That's the only detail you need to remember for now. I grew up on land my great-great-grandfather, Ezekiel Coleman, homesteaded in 1897. He came out from Missouri with a wagon, 2 mules, and a hand-drawn well drilling rig he'd built himself out of railroad iron. He wasn't looking for gold, he was looking for water. What he found 80 feet down on a scrubby patch of ground the locals called Dead Man's Flat was something better than gold in that part of the Rockies. A hot spring, 141 degrees at the source, flowing steady as a heartbeat 12 months a year. Ezekiel built a well house over it out of native limestone, cut by hand, mortared with lime he burned himself. That well house stood for 126 years. I used to run my palm over those stones as a boy and feel the warmth coming up through the rock even in January, even with snow stacked 3 feet against the north wall. My grandfather used to say that spring was the only member of the family who never had a bad day. The Coleman family built a life around that water. Cattle drank from the runoff pond behind the barn. It never froze, not once, not in 120 years. My grandmother did her wash in a stone trough fed straight off the springhouse line. And starting in the 1970s, when a developer came sniffing around wanting to buy up the surrounding acreage for a housing project, my father made one condition non-negotiable: the thermal water rights and the underground pipe easement running off our land stayed in the Coleman name, forever. In writing, recorded at the county courthouse in 1974, Deed Book 212, page 88, easement for what the paperwork called geothermal conveyance, perpetual, appurtenant to the Coleman homestead parcel. Nobody in that housing development ever asked what that meant. They just wanted cheap heat. And for 40 years they got it, piped in from our land through 6-inch insulated lines nobody could see, buried 3 feet under the frost line, running under streets with names like Aspen Court and Cottonwood Lane. The developer knew. He built it into the marketing brochures. Geothermally warmed community, year-round comfort, lowest utility bills in the county. Then he died, sold his company, and the paperwork about where that heat actually came from got quietly lost somewhere between 3 different HOA management companies over 4 decades. My father passed in 2019. He left me the ranch, 110 acres, a farmhouse with a hand-built oak dining table my great-grandmother's brother made in 1899, 3 generations of Colemans buried under cottonwood trees on the ridge behind the barn, and that wellhouse, still standing, still steaming, still exactly where Ezekiel put it. I hadn't lived on the ranch full-time in almost 20 years. I'd been consulting on municipal water systems, mostly out of Denver, mostly geothermal and groundwater compliance work, the kind of job that makes you very boring at dinner parties and very useful in ways nobody notices until they need you. When my father died, I finally came home. I figured I'd spend my last working years exactly where I started, watching steam rise off Dead Man's Flat in the cold morning air, smelling that faint mineral tang of sulfur and wet limestone, listening to the low hum of the pump house my grandfather installed in 1962. I did not expect to find a woman in a cream-coloured Chanel-style suit standing in my yard with a clipboard, flanked by a bobcat excavator, and a man in a hard hat informing me that my great-grandfather's wellhouse was, and I quote, an unpermitted structure that constitutes a safety hazard to the Comanche Ridge Estate's common areas. Carol Ashworth had been president of the Comanche Ridge Estates Homeowners Association for 6 years. She drove a white Range Rover with a vanity plate that read HOA Boss, which I always assumed was a joke until I realized she meant it sincerely. She wore blazers that cost more than my truck payment and carried a leather clipboard folio with the HOA crest embossed in gold. She had a way of tilting her head when she talked to homeowners, like she was doing them a favor just by making eye contact. "Mr. Coleman," she said that morning, not even looking up from her clipboard. The board voted unanimously in March to relocate the community's antiquated water infrastructure to make way for the new clubhouse veranda. This parcel was flagged as abandoned agricultural property. "This parcel," I said, "has 3 generations of my family buried on it." She glanced toward the cottonwoods on the ridge, where the fence line and the old headstones were clearly visible from where we stood, and said, "Then I'd suggest you contact the county about proper zoning for a private cemetery. As for the well structure, it's already down. I'm sure you understand. Safety first." I didn't say anything else. I want you to remember that. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten her. I took out my phone and I started recording the time. 7:52 a.m., Tuesday, October the 14th. I photographed the crushed limestone. I photographed the bobcat's tracks running straight through the edge of my family's fence line. And I photographed Carol Ashworth's face, tilted at that same condescending angle, completely unaware that she had just spent $400,000 in HOA reserves bulldozing the only thing standing between 210 families and a very, very cold winter. The fine arrived 4 days later. Certified mail, HOA letterhead, gold crest, dated October 18th. $640 for unauthorized structure encroaching on association common ground, plus a separate line item for removal and disposal billed to homeowner. I read it twice standing at my own mailbox at the end of my own driveway, on land my family had owned since McKinley was president, being billed by strangers for the demolition of my great-grandfather's wellhouse. There was a second document folded inside it, a Notice of Encroachment Resolution, supposedly signed by a county surveyor named R. Delgado, stating that the wellhouse parcel had been administratively reclassified as HOA Common Area per Comanche Ridge Estates Governing Documents, Article 4, Section 2, recorded 1981. I'd worked with county recorders my whole professional life. I know what a real surveyor stamp looks like, and I know what a scanned, resized, slightly blurry photocopy of one looks like when somebody's pasted it onto a document in a hurry. I didn't call Carol Ashworth. I didn't write an angry email. I did what 31 years of regulatory work trained me to do. I built a file. I photographed the fine, front and back, with a timestamp overlay. I photographed the postmark. I drove into town that same afternoon and pulled the actual recorded plat for Comanche Ridge Estates at the Larimer County Clerk and Recorder's Office, and I paid $11 for a certified copy showing that Article 4, Section 2 of the governing documents, recorded in 1981, said nothing whatsoever about my parcel. My parcel wasn't even inside the platted subdivision. It never had been. It was excluded specifically, by name, in the 1981 filing because my father wouldn't sell it. Here's what most homeowners don't know. An HOA board cannot unilaterally reclassify private property as common area by simply voting on it and mailing you a letter. Real property reclassification requires a recorded amendment to the plat, notarized, filed with the county, and, in Colorado, proper notice to the actual owner under the Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act, CRS Section 38-33.3-217. Carol Ashworth's board hadn't filed anything. They printed a letter that looked official and mailed it to a man they assumed didn't know the difference. I paid the $11 for the certified plat copy. I did not pay the $640 fine. On Tuesday, October 21st at 2:47 p.m., I walked into the Comanche Ridge Estates Clubhouse for the monthly HOA board meeting. I remember the time because it was printed at the top of the agenda, taped to the door. Board meeting, Tuesday, 2:47 p.m. Somebody had even typed the minute into the header, like precision mattered to them everywhere except where it counted. The clubhouse smelled like fresh paint and new carpet glue, and underneath that, faintly, like wet concrete, the new veranda slab poured directly over what used to be Dead Man's Flat. I sat in the back row of folding chairs. Carol Ashworth stood at a podium with a laser pointer, walking 11 homeowners and a property manager through a slideshow titled Comanche Ridge Estates, a Vision for 2025. When she saw me, she didn't stop talking. She just raised her voice slightly, the way people do when they want everyone in the room to notice someone without looking at them directly. For those unfamiliar, she said, there was some confusion this month regarding a structure removal on the northeast boundary. I want to assure everyone that the board acted well within its authority on legal advice to protect the community's investment in our shared amenities. That structure was 126 years old, I said. It wasn't on your boundary, it was on mine. A ripple went through the folding chairs. Carol Ashworth smiled the way you smile at a child who's interrupted a dinner party. Mr. Coleman, I understand this is emotional for you, but the board has documentation. So do I said, and I didn't raise my voice at all. I have the certified plat from the county. Your parcel line stops 400 feet short of where that wellhouse stood. I also have a copy of the letter your office sent me with a forged surveyor stamp on it. I'd be careful using the word documentation in a room full of witnesses. The room went very quiet. Somewhere near the front, an older man in a flannel jacket, sitting next to a woman with an oxygen tank on a small wheeled cart, let out a low whistle. That was the first time I saw Dorothy Meeks. She was 78 years old, a widow, her late husband a Korean War veteran who'd built their house on Cottonwood Lane back in 1979 with his own 2 hands and his own military pension. She wasn't the one on oxygen that night. That was her neighbor, Harold Voss, sitting beside her. Dorothy just looked tired. Tired in a way that had nothing to do with the meeting. Carol Ashworth's smile didn't move, but something behind her eyes did. We'll take this up in executive session, she said, and moved on to the next slide. I stayed in my seat until the meeting ended. I filed everything from that night too, a voice memo recording, which Colorado law allows since it's a one-party consent state, and my own handwritten notes with the time at the top, 2:47 p.m. I was building something. I didn't know yet exactly what shape it would take. I just knew that a woman who forges a surveyor's stamp over a 100-year-old wellhouse doesn't stop there. I was right. It took me 3 weeks of quiet digging to understand what I was actually looking at. I started with the HOA's public meeting minutes, which by Colorado law, CRS Section 38-33.3-209.5, homeowners associations are required to make available to any owner requesting them, or in some cases to any interested party, depending on the governing documents. Comanche Ridge Estates, generous as ever, charged 25 cents a page for copies. I paid it. 4 years of minutes, 4 years of budget reports, 4 years of vendor invoices, all of it stacked in a banker's box on my kitchen table under my great-great-grandmother's oil lamp. The pattern jumped out at me faster than I expected, mostly because I'd spent 3 decades reading exactly this kind of paperwork for a living. Every single homeowner in Comanche Ridge Estates paid a monthly HOA due of $340. On top of that, since 2020, every homeowner also paid a separate line item called the Sustainable Geothermal Heating Assessment, $600 a month, billed directly, not optional, tied to what the HOA called Community-Wide Eco-Heating Infrastructure Maintenance. 210 homes, $600. That's $126,000 a month, every month, for 4 straight years. I did the math sitting at that oak table my great-great-uncle built in 1899, running my thumb along a burn scar in the wood my grandmother always said came from a branding iron somebody set down without thinking. $126,000 times 12 months times 4 years. Just over $6 million total collected. But when I dug into the disbursement records, I found something even stranger. Only a fraction of it ever left the HOA's operating account for anything resembling maintenance. The rest, roughly $2.4 million of it, had been paid out over 4 years to a vendor called Ashworth Geothermal Services LLC for quarterly thermal loop inspection, valve servicing, and emergency repair retainer. I am a licensed geothermal well operator. I have been for 31 years. There is exactly one geothermal source feeding that neighborhood, and it comes off my land, through my family's easement, from a well I have serviced myself, personally, twice a year since I was 22 years old. There is no thermal loop maintenance company. There has never needed to be one. The system runs on gravity-fed convection through insulated pipe, checked twice annually, and it hadn't been serviced by anyone but a Coleman since Eisenhower was president. Ashworth Geothermal Services LLC was registered with the Colorado Secretary of State in 2019. Registered agent, Carol Ashworth. Same address as her house on Ridge Overlook Court. Same month she took over as HOA board president. I sat there a long time with that banker's box open in front of me, steam curling faintly outside my kitchen window off the ruined patch where the Wellhouse used to stand, and I understood, finally, what I was actually dealing with. This wasn't a woman who'd bulldozed an old stone building out of ignorance or arrogance alone. This was a woman running a $2.4 million invoice fraud on 210 households, using a resource she didn't own, didn't understand, and had just spent $400,000 of HOA reserves trying to physically erase the evidence of. 3 days later, Dorothy Meeks knocked on my door. She was holding a manila folder against her chest like it might blow away, even though there wasn't a breath of wind. Her hands were shaking, and not from the cold. "Mr. Coleman," she said, "I need to show you something, and I need you to tell me if I'm losing my mind." I invited her in, sat her down at the oak table, and put the kettle on. She opened the folder. Inside was a lien notice from Comanche Ridge Estates dated that week, threatening foreclosure on her house, the house her husband built with his own hands after 2 tours in Korea, over $11,000 in unpaid geothermal assessments she said she'd never once missed a payment on. Attached to the lien was a letter signed by Carol Ashworth suggesting that if Dorothy would simply corroborate the board's position regarding the unauthorized cemetery encroachment on the northeast parcel, the association would consider a compassionate resolution to her account. They were trying to buy her testimony against me with her own home as collateral. I looked at that letter for a long moment, and then I looked at Dorothy Meeks, 78 years old, oxygen-free, but exhausted in a way I recognized, sitting at the same table where my father used to sign contracts, my grandfather used to play dominoes, and my great-great-grandfather probably ate his first hot meal after driving that well 80 feet into the ground. and I thought about the valve sitting in the crushed remains of the wellhouse outside, still buried, still connected to 210 furnaces that had no idea how close winter actually was. "Dorothy," I said, "you're not losing your mind, and I think it's time somebody showed this town exactly what's under their feet." Dorothy left that folder with me. I made a copy at the library in town, mailed the original back to her via certified mail so there'd be a paper trail showing chain of custody, and started a second banker's box. This one I labeled, in black marker, Ashworth, Pattern of Coercion. Here's what most homeowners don't know. Under Colorado's Common Interest Ownership Act, CRS Section 38-33.3-316, an HOA cannot impose or collect an assessment that isn't authorized by the governing documents and cannot foreclose on a lien based on a fraudulent or unauthorized charge. If Carol Ashworth's geothermal assessment was never properly adopted by the membership, and I now had 4 years of minutes proving it was simply announced, not voted on by the homeowners as required, then every lien filed against every house in that neighborhood over an unpaid eco-heating bill was built on sand. I didn't say any of this out loud yet, I just kept building the box. I drove to the county courthouse again on a Thursday morning, cold enough that my truck's windshield needed scraping, and pulled the full corporate filing history for Ashworth Geothermal Services LLC. Registered 2019. No employees on record with the Department of Labor. No contractor's license on file with the state for geothermal or HVAC work of any kind. A requirement under Colorado law for anyone billing for mechanical system servicing above a certain threshold. I requested copies of every invoice Ashworth Geothermal had submitted to the HOA for the past 4 years. Using my rights as a homeowner-adjacent party under the association's own disclosure bylaws, since the assessment had technically been billed against my easement property as well, whether I'd ever agreed to it or not. The invoices were almost comical once you knew what to look for. Line items for thermal loop pressure testing on dates when I personally remembered standing at that exact wellhouse doing my own twice-annual inspection, alone, with nobody from any LLC anywhere near the property. Line items for emergency valve replacement totaling $18,000 in a single January. The same January, I'd replaced one $20 gasket myself on my own time with tools that had belonged to my father. I didn't confront her, not yet. I kept photographing, kept dating everything, kept a written log in a hardbound notebook the way I'd been trained to for regulatory audits 30 years ago. Because a log written in real time, dated and signed, holds up in court in ways a reconstructed memory never will. The escalation came on a Saturday morning in early November, 9 days before the season's first hard freeze was forecast. I know the date because the Weather Service alert was on my phone when Dorothy Meeks called me at 6:15 a.m., her voice cracking. "Walt," she said, "they're at Harold's place. You need to come." Harold Voss lived 2 doors down from Dorothy on Cottonwood Lane. 79 years old, retired Army, on a home oxygen concentrator 22 hours a day after a lifetime of breathing diesel exhaust and dust on airfields from Da Nang to Fort Bliss. His wife had passed 3 years earlier, and he'd built a small memorial garden in his front yard, her name carved into a granite bench, rose bushes she'd planted years ago, a small solar light shaped like a dove that Harold refilled with batteries every spring like it was a sacred duty. When I got there, Carol Ashworth was standing in Harold's driveway in a burgundy blazer, clipboard in hand, and behind her, a man I didn't recognize was operating a small bobcat loader, its bucket raised over the edge of the memorial garden. "Mrs. Ashworth," I heard Harold shout from his porch, his voice thin and rattling behind his cannula. "That's my wife's garden. You can't just—" "Mr. Voss, this bed is encroaching 18 inches onto association-maintained right-of-way," Carol said, not even glancing at him, tapping her clipboard. "It was flagged in the September landscape audit. I have full board authorization." I raised my phone and started recording. 6:31 a.m., November 9th. I have that footage still. You can hear Harold's oxygen concentrator humming through the cold morning air, that steady mechanical wheeze. and you can hear Carol Ashworth say, clear as a bell, "If you want to keep the bench, Mr. Voss, I'd suggest paying down your assessment balance before the board reconsiders its compassionate exceptions policy." That was the moment I understood what kind of woman I was truly dealing with. She wasn't threatening to find somebody. She was threatening a widower's memorial to his dead wife, to squeeze more money out of a fraudulent bill, on camera, in front of witnesses, at 6:30 in the morning. The Bobcat operator hesitated. Harold started down his porch steps too fast, his oxygen line catching on the railing, and Dorothy ran, actually ran, 78 years old, to steady him before he fell. I stepped between the Bobcat and the garden bed, phone still recording, and said, loud enough for everyone on the block to hear over the idling engine, "This is being recorded. Destruction of private memorial property is criminal mischief under Colorado Revised Statute 18-4-501. I'd also point out that right-of-way encroachment claims require a certified survey, which this association does not have, because I've already pulled the plat." Carol Ashworth's face did something I hadn't seen it do before. Something tightened around her eyes, but she didn't back down, not fully. She told the operator to hold position and told me she'd have her attorney contact me. Then she got in her Range Rover and left, gravel spitting from the tires. The Bobcat operator, to his credit, lowered the bucket and left too, muttering something about not getting paid enough for this. Harold sat down hard on his wife's memorial bench, breathing heavy, Dorothy's hand on his shoulder. "I'm all right," he kept saying, though nobody had asked. "I'm all right." That was the moment the plan stopped being about paperwork and started being about timing. I want to be clear about something, because it matters for what came next. I did not sabotage anything. I did not damage a single pipe, valve, or piece of association property. Everything I did from that morning forward was built entirely on rights I already legally held, documented 6 ways from Sunday, with permits and notices filed well in advance. The first thing I did was call my attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya Rao out of Fort Collins, who specialized in water and mineral rights litigation. I'd worked with her office years earlier on a municipal case. She confirmed what I already believed. The 1974 deed granting the Coleman family perpetual thermal water rights and pipeline easement was still valid, still recorded, and, critically, contained a reversion clause. If the receiving party, meaning the developer's successors and eventually the HOA itself, ever failed to maintain the agreed compensation arrangement or interfered with the source infrastructure, the grantor, meaning me, retained the right to suspend service with 30 days written notice. The HOA had never paid the Coleman family 1 cent for that heat in 40 years. It had been a goodwill arrangement my father maintained out of neighborliness, never billed, never invoiced. And they had just destroyed the physical wellhouse protecting the source. Priya drafted the notice. I filed it with the county recorder to make it part of the public record, and I sent it via certified mail, return receipt requested, to the HOA's registered agent, Carol Ashworth herself, on November 12th. The notice stated, in plain legal language, that due to unauthorized destruction of critical wellhead infrastructure on Coleman family property and pending resolution of ownership and liability, geothermal service to Comanche Ridge Estates would be suspended in 30 days, per the terms of Deed Book 212, page 88, recorded 1974. 30 days put the shutoff date at December 12th. The National Weather Service was already forecasting the season's first Arctic front to hit the region around December 10th through 14th. I hadn't planned that. I didn't need to. Colorado winters take care of themselves. I also did something else, quietly, in that same week. I filed for a scheduled inspection with the County Building and Water Resources Department, invoking my rights as a licensed geothermal operator to have an independent third party present when I accessed my own wellhead, both to document the damage the HOA had caused and to have an official witness on record for whatever came next. I requested the county send an inspector, and separately, through Priya's office, I arranged for a notary public to be present at the site on the shutoff date to formally witness and document the valve closure for legal purposes. I invited exactly one more person to that appointment, a local reporter named Denise Okafor from the regional paper who'd been quietly looking into HOA assessment complaints across 3 counties for months and had, coincidentally, already received an anonymous tip about irregular geothermal billing at Comanche Ridge Estates 2 weeks earlier. I hadn't sent that tip. I never found out who did. I had a suspicion it might have been Dorothy. By the last week of November, everything was in place. The notarized notice on file, the county inspector scheduled, the reporter aware and interested, pre-arouse legal file 3 inches thick, and 2 banker's boxes of evidence sitting on my kitchen table under my great-great-uncle's oak beams. Carol Ashworth had received her 30-day notice. She hadn't responded to it. She hadn't corrected a single lien. She hadn't even acknowledged that a 126-year-old deed might actually mean something. She was, as far as I could tell, still telling the board that the Wellhouse issue was resolved and that the Coleman situation was being handled by counsel. I let her believe that. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a person about to lose everything is let them enjoy their last few weeks of certainty. December 12th came in hard and grey, the sky the colour of dishwater, wind cutting off the foothills at maybe 15 degrees with the chill factored in. My breath hung in front of my face like smoke as I walked out to what was left of the Wellhouse. Just a mound of frozen backfill now, with a single access hatch I'd had a contractor install 2 weeks earlier to reach the valve manifold without disturbing the county's evidence markers. 3 vehicles were already parked along my fence line by 9 a.m. A white sedan from the County Water Resources Department with an inspector named Frank Ibarra stepping out in a canvas jacket, breath-fogging, clipboard of his own, an honest one. A modest grey Honda belonging to Denise Okafor, the reporter, who had her photographer with her, a young man with a long lens already checking his light meter against the flat winter sky. And Priya Rao's black SUV, from which she emerged with a leather folio and a notary public named Evelyn Cho, a small, precise woman in a heavy coat who'd agreed to witness and formally document the valve closure per Colorado Revised Statute 1255-110, governing notarial acts performed in connection with property rights actions. Dorothy Meeks came too, wrapped in a wool coat that had probably belonged to her husband, standing beside Harold Voss, whose oxygen concentrator was strapped into a rolling cart, its hum steady against the wind. I hadn't asked either of them to come. They'd asked me. I want to describe the valve itself, because it matters. It was brass, corroded green at the edges, 12 inches across, bolted into a cast iron wellhead my great-grandfather had sunk into bedrock in 1897. My grandfather had replaced the seals in 1962. My father had replaced them again in 1988. I had checked that valve with my own hands every spring and fall for 30 years. It didn't look like much. It looked like a piece of old farm equipment somebody forgot to haul off. It was, in fact, the only thing standing between 210 houses and a Colorado winter. Frank Ibarra confirmed, on record in front of Denise Okafor's recorder, that the wellhead and manifold were located entirely within the Coleman deeded parcel, per the certified plat, and that the HOA's excavation work in October had, in his professional opinion, caused direct structural damage to the original Wellhouse foundation, a violation, potentially, of Colorado's cultural and agricultural structure protections, though that was a matter for another day. Evelyn Cho read aloud, for the recording, the terms of the 30-day notice filed November 12th, confirmed it had gone unanswered, and confirmed the reversion clause under Deed Book 212, page 88, was now in full effect. Then she looked at me and said, "Mr. Coleman, you may proceed." I knelt down in the frozen mud, wrapped both hands around the valve's iron wheel, cold enough to burn through my gloves, and I turned it clockwise. It took 4 full turns before I felt the resistance change, felt the water hammer echo faintly up through the pipe beneath my boots, and then nothing. Just wind. Just the small sound of the notary's pen scratching against her log. Time and date of closure, Evelyn Cho said aloud, for the record. December 12th, 9:47 a.m. I want to be honest with you, I did not feel triumphant kneeling there. I felt tired and cold and a little sad, thinking about my great-grandfather driving that well 80 feet down with mules and railroad iron, never imagining that 126 years later, his great-great-grandson would be shutting it off to make a point to strangers. But then I thought about Harold Voss's oxygen concentrator and Dorothy Meeks's lean notice, and I stood back up. The temperature that night dropped to 11 degrees. By the following morning, according to the county's own after-action report, 43 homes in Comanche Ridge Estates had no functioning heat. By December 14th, that number was 161. Furnaces that had never been serviced because the HOA's furnace budget had gone into Carol Ashworth's LLC instead, failed within hours of the ambient temperature dropping. Pipes burst in at least 19 homes. The clubhouse itself, the one built over Dead Man's Flat, over my family's Wellhouse, had no backup heating system installed at all, because the entire building's design had assumed geothermal service would simply exist forever, for free, with no contingency. Carol Ashworth's response was, in the end, exactly what I expected of her. On the evening of December 14th, with temperatures at 9 degrees and falling, she drove out to my property in her Range Rover, parked crooked across my driveway, and got out carrying, of all things, a battery-powered angle grinder. Denise Okafor's photographer, who had been quietly parked down the road on a tip from Dorothy Meeks that Carol had been making threats at the emergency board meeting that afternoon, caught the entire thing on a long lens from 60 yards away. Carol walked straight to my access hatch, knelt down, and started trying to cut through the padlock securing it. A padlock installed legally on my own property over my own valve, with a printed notice zip-tied to the chain reading, "Private property, geothermal wellhead, unauthorized access, prosecutable under CRS 18-4-501. I'd already called the sheriff's non-emergency line an hour earlier, when Dorothy tipped me off, and Larimer County Sheriff's Deputy Ruben Castillo was parked, lights off, less than a quarter-mile down the county road, exactly where I'd asked him to wait. When the angle grinder's blade threw its first shower of sparks against the padlock, Deputy Castillo's cruiser lights came on, and he rolled up my driveway slow and deliberate, exactly the way you'd want a professional to do it. Carol Ashworth froze mid-cut, grinder still whining, sparks dying in the dark. "Ma'am, step away from the equipment," Deputy Castillo said, climbing out, flashlight up. "This is my community's infrastructure," Carol said, and even then, even caught red-handed with a power tool against another man's padlock in the freezing dark, she still had that tilted, condescending certainty in her voice. "I have every right. Ma'am, this is recorded as private property belonging to Walter Coleman, under a deed dated 1974, confirmed by County Plat," Deputy Castillo said. "You're attempting to force entry onto a wellhead that isn't yours, with a tool that isn't licensed for that purpose, at night, with no authorization on file." He held up his own copy. Priya Rao had, weeks earlier, filed the deed and the shut-off notice with the Sheriff's Civil Division as a precaution, so any responding officer would have the paperwork in hand before ever setting foot on my land. "Ma'am, please put the grinder down and step back from the hatch." She did not put the grinder down right away. For about 4 seconds, caught in Deputy Castillo's flashlight beam, with Denise Okafor's photographer's shutter clicking softly 60 yards off in the dark, Carol Ashworth just stood there, breathing hard, looking at the padlock, looking at me standing on my own porch in a coat over my pajamas, looking at Dorothy Meeks and Harold Voss, who had driven over together the moment they heard the sheriff's radio traffic on a scanner Harold kept from his army days, both of them standing at the edge of my yard, bundled against the cold, watching. Then she set the grinder down in the frozen mud, and Deputy Castillo took her into custody for attempted criminal mischief and trespass, right there under my porch light at 8:52 p.m. on December 14th. That arrest and the criminal mischief charge attached to it opened the door for a full county investigation into Ashworth Geothermal Services LLC, An investigation that, once the Sheriff's Financial Crimes Unit and the District Attorney's Office got their hands on my 2 bankers' boxes, moved faster than I ever expected. The investigation took 4 months. In the end, Carol Ashworth was charged with felony theft by deception under CRS Section 184401, forgery under CRS Section 185102 for the fabricated surveyor's stamp, and criminal mischief and trespass for the December 14th incident. She pled guilty to the theft and forgery charges in a deal that avoided trial. The court ordered restitution of $2,394,000, the full amount collected through the fraudulent geothermal assessment over 4 years, to be paid to the 210 affected homeowners, prorated by how long they'd lived in the community and how much they'd paid in. She was sentenced to 6 years, with parole eligibility after 3, and permanently barred from serving on any homeowners association board or managing any common interest community in the state of Colorado. The Range Rover was seized and sold at auction, along with her house on Ridge Overlook Court. Both applied toward the restitution total. The property manager who'd helped process the fraudulent invoices, a soft-spoken man named Gerald Finch, testified against her in exchange for a lesser charge and probation, having claimed, credibly, according to the DA, that he'd raised concerns twice in writing and been ignored. The Bobcat operator from Harold's front yard was never charged with anything. He'd been a subcontractor with no knowledge of the underlying fraud, and he later told Denise Okafor, on record, that he'd quit the contracting company the same week out of what he called a bad feeling in my gut. The Homeowners Association itself was placed under a court-appointed monitor for 18 months, while new bylaws were drafted, real ones this time, reviewed by independent counsel. At the first legitimate board election that followed, Dorothy Meeks was voted in as president of Comanche Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, unanimously, with Harold Voss as vice president. I heard she cried a little at the podium, and that somebody in the back row shouted that she'd earned it, and that this time nobody tilted their head with a clipboard while they said it. As for the geothermal heat, I turned the valve back on, of course, 3 days after Carol's arrest, once the county inspector confirmed the Wellhouse damage assessment was complete, and Priya Rao had drafted a proper paid easement agreement between the Coleman family and the newly reformed HOA, this time at fair market rate with real maintenance performed by me under my actual license, invoiced honestly. I waived the first year's fee entirely. I told Dorothy it was the least I could do for people who'd shown up for a stranger with a padlock and a grievance in the cold at night because it was the right thing to do. I rebuilt the Wellhouse myself that spring, using as much of the original limestone as I could salvage from the frozen mound the Bobcat had left behind. It doesn't look exactly like Ezekiel's did. Some of the stones are cracked now, chipped at the edges, but it stands. Steam still rises off it in the cold mornings, same as it always has, and some mornings I still walk out there before sunrise, run my hand along the warm stone, and think about how close 210 families came to losing something they never even knew they had. Here's what I learned, if you're still with me. First, never sign anything or accept any accusation from an HOA board without pulling the actual recorded documents yourself. Clipboards lie, county records don't. Second, a fine you don't legally owe is not a fine. It's an invitation to fight, and you should take it. Third, the people running these boards count on you not knowing your own rights, and on you being too tired or too polite to check. And fourth, maybe the one that matters most, sometimes the quietest man in the room, the one everybody assumes is just some rancher, has spent 31 years becoming exactly the person you shouldn't have crossed. I still have that oak table my great-great-uncle built in 1899. I still eat breakfast on it every morning, steam from my coffee mixing with steam through the kitchen window from the Wellhouse outside. Last week, a woman named Renata Cole from a homeowners association 2 counties over called my office, asking, very carefully, whether I'd ever consider consulting on a water rights dispute of her own. I haven't called her back yet, but I've got a feeling I will.